This is a complicated story. Trump has oversimplified this from the very beginning. This is not a story that ends in 24 hours. This is not a story where he can just bang everyone's heads together and make it all happen. Putin is in this war for his own personal, physical survival. He understands that if he's not in power, he dies.
So Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
It is a special episode, I should say. We don't usually speak on a weekend, but we have to. Of course, this meeting took place between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin on Friday afternoon or overnight for you and I. But I want to start off to catch our audience up from the very beginning. Trump and Putin, they met on the tarmac runway. It was quite a warm and smiley meeting, kind of dissimilar to what we've seen with other world leaders and Donald Trump. But what was your immediate reaction to seeing the two reunite like this?
Well, I mean, it was really kind of a travesty that this war criminal, this man who had started a war, invaded a neighboring country, broken every international law, was being given the literal red carpet treatment. I think that anybody who has been dealing with Putin watching this, bristled when they saw that image. But after that ugly image, everyone was then hoping, okay, well, maybe something would be accomplished here. Maybe there would be some type of threat made by President Trump to Putin. Maybe that the threat would be significant enough to force Putin to stop his invasion. But as we know, either that threat wasn't made or that threat didn't have any impact because Putin left that meeting and there was no outcome whatsoever in terms of a ceasefire.
Bill, while the two were posing for photos on the tarmac, we saw a military flyover taking place, a row of US fighter jets and helicopters, including F-22 Raptors. They were situated on the tarmac surrounding Trump and Putin. Now, any analysts would say that this was a show of strength from the US's side to surround Vladimir Putin with these. But from your point of view, would you consider this the last gesture of strength from the United States before the meeting took place?
Well, at the end of the day, a gesture of strength is exercising strength. You can put a bunch of airplanes in the sky and do all that kind of stuff, but the things that Putin cares about are we going to impose crippling sanctions on his oil industry so that he can't sell his oil? Are we going to confiscate his central bank reserves, which are frozen in the West? Are we going to provide Ukraine with lethal military aid so they can strike military targets in Russia? Those are shows of strength. All this other stuff is symbolism, which is completely unhelpful at this point.
Well, let's get into the meeting, Bill. It took 3 hours. Afterwards, there was a press conference. It was a 12-minute. Well, I don't even want to call it a press conference, actually, because it was just two statements, mostly from Putin and then from Donald Trump. And they didn't give much detail on exactly what was discussed or what was agreed upon. But the main takeaway was that there wasn't a mention of a ceasefire. What was your reaction to that?
Well, since this war has begun, it's always been obvious to me that Putin needs this war for a very specific purpose. Putin needs this war to distract the Russian people from his own failures as a leader. If he can't succeed as a leader, and he's been there for 25 years, and he can't make life better for Russian people, and he doesn't want them to be mad at him, he needs to create a foreign enemy and start a war. That's what this war in Ukraine is all about. It's not about the peace of Donbass or it's not about NATO enlargement. This is a war for Vladimir Putin to stay in power. And there was nothing that could be offered by Donald Trump, no matter what he was doing in Alaska or anywhere else, that could guarantee Putin that he would be able to stay in power. Therefore, there was no chance. From the very beginning, it's been obvious to me, since this war started, that there's no chance that Putin is ever going to pull back. The only way that you get him to pull back is because of absolute necessity. If he has a boot on the throat, if he has no other choice. And he's so far away from absolute necessity right now that it didn't surprise me at all. I predicted it before the meeting, and I continue to predict that until we impose devastating consequences on Russia and Vladimir Putin, he's not going to come to the table.
But Bill, we thought, well, you of course didn't think this would happen, but Donald Trump's threats before the meeting were that Putin would be subjected to serious consequences if a ceasefire, at the very least, isn't agreed upon in this meeting. And we heard nothing about that afterwards.
And as we know, Donald Trump has made these ultimatums. This was now the 6th time he had made an ultimatum. And of course, there's a very famous story about the boy who cries wolf. You can only scream wolf so many times before you lose credibility. And so Trump has lost credibility with Putin by making these threats, and it's obvious he has no intention of following through on them. Now, it's interesting where we are right now in terms of U.S. politics, because a recent poll came out showing that Republicans are now much more open and supportive of the idea of helping Ukraine. That there's something like 85 to 90% of Americans think Vladimir Putin is an evil man. And so in the U.S. political system right now, Trump is going to be returning home to Washington, not just to Democrats, but to Republicans and independents, with a population that really wants to get tough on Russia. And so whatever was said or not promised in the aftermath of this meeting, he's going to be under very serious political pressure in Washington to follow through and start imposing these sanctions and these tariffs and all these other penalties to try to get Russia to basically stop fighting this war. And so I think that we're in a dynamic situation. Whatever is said or not said, I think it's interesting to watch the disappointment that's going to start coming out in Washington over the next hours and days.
So you think Americans on both sides of the political aisle from every crevice of the country will have lost a bit of respect for him today?
I think that the Republicans continue to support him, but I think that they will have lost any feeling of giving him the benefit of the doubt on Putin. I think that we're going to see going forward a much more strident position in Washington about Vladimir Putin, about supporting Ukraine. Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal, Republican and Democrat, and of course Lindsey Graham being a big ally of Trump, have a piece of legislation which is waiting in the wings, which would impose 500% sanctions on countries that continue to buy Russian oil. It has 84 Senate co-sponsors. They could put it for vote in a minute and it would pass. It couldn't be vetoed by Trump, and if that were to be put into play, that would actually have the desired effect on Russia, which would be to basically make it impossible for them to sell their oil. If they couldn't sell their oil, they'd run out of money very quickly. If they run out of money very quickly, they could end up being in a very desperate situation. And that would be the environment in which Putin might agree to some type of settlement to this war.
And you and I spoke off camera about how reports, Ukrainian intelligence is suggesting that the Kremlin or Putin has already started slashing wages for Russian troops, which was a major incentive for why they were fighting, because they were getting paid more than the average Russian would in, of course, a country that has such a devastating economy. Bill, but this sanctions bill that you mentioned, of course, Congress, they're on recess. They return early September. The reason that we predict is the why they haven't brought it to the Senate floor is because to not really rock the boat with Donald Trump, to let him kind of handle this on his own. Do you think that they will give up doing that and take it to the Senate floor as soon as they return?
Probably not. I think that Lindsey Graham is not going to publicly humiliate his ally. But at the same time, the pressure has to be on Trump now. He looks foolish. I mean, there's no way to spin this at even among his most ardent supporters, and he's got a lot of other political pressure going on right now. There's the whole Epstein story and so on, and so he can't look weak. He looks weak right now, and he's got to do something. So whatever has happened in the last 12 hours, I think we can't really extrapolate from that. I think we need to see how things play themselves out. And he's very conscious of what people are saying about him on television, on Fox News, on MSNBC. And so let's see how he reacts to what's an obvious abject failure of trying to convince Putin to back off on this war.
Bill, Trump referred to this meeting as a 10 out of 10 in terms of successes. Of course, he said that despite the fact that there was no ceasefire. How do you think that commentary from him would make Ukraine or Zelensky feel?
Well, I think that Zelensky is probably breathing a huge sigh of relief right now. The real downside scenario would have been if Trump had gone to Alaska, met with Putin, they agreed that a certain chunk of Ukraine should be handed to Putin, and then taking that agreement to Zelensky and saying, are you yes or no? Zelensky says no, and then Trump gets mad at Zelensky. That would have been the worst case scenario, and I think that they must all be breathing a big sigh of relief, and I'm sure the same thing is true in European capitals, that this sort of non-outcome is better than a very negative Putin-Trump agreement outcome. And so we're no worse off than we were 24 hours ago in terms of this whole thing. Europe, the UK, other countries support Ukraine. And then the question is, now that Putin has snubbed his nose at Trump, will Trump provide more military aid? Will he provide sanctions? And I think that this actually does set the backdrop for a better political tone for him if he wants to step in and support Ukraine, which is that's the only way that this war is going to end is on the battlefield and in the economic sphere when Putin has a boot on the throat and feels the pressure that he has to do something.
But Bill, I wonder if we're not out of the woods when it comes to giving up this land. Of course, Trump said that they agreed upon many points, but a few big ones, and a very big one, he said they hadn't quite gotten there yet. He later went on Sean Hannity's show. He said that they had largely agreed upon land swaps, potential US security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, we'd always questioned if, obviously, there's a constitution at play here. Donald Trump can't just hand over land to Russia, but he can, of course, come back to Zelensky and say, look, this is the only way we're going to get a deal done, which is, of course, what we've seen over the last few months. But do you think that Trump has agreed to swap some Ukrainian land? And swap is not the right word. It's give Russia Ukrainian land at 19% of Ukrainian land they currently occupy, which includes Crimea, of course, and that perhaps he will say, well, look, that means I'm going to have to give Ukraine US security.
Well, very, very simply, I think Trump would agree to almost anything. I mean, he will agree to almost anything. But the fact of the matter is that Putin wouldn't agree to that. Putin has not dialed down his ambitions 1 inch. Putin wants the whole of Ukraine. He doesn't want. He has not proposed that if everything was stopped here, he would stop. He's not proposed that. That's not been. His ambitions are much more ambitious, and so it doesn't really matter what this is not fantasy football. We're not playing Risk here. It doesn't really matter what Trump thinks here. But all that matters is what Putin thinks. Putin is the guy at war. Putin is the guy who has to decide not to be at war. He has not shown any inclination to back down from his war. He thinks he's winning. All this red carpet stuff only emboldens him. And the only way to stop him from feeling that way is to put him in an impossible situation, which he's far from being in at the moment. But we do have the capacity to put him in that situation. The United States can impose crippling economic consequences. The United States can create crippling military consequences. Europe can do the same, and that's what we should be doing, and that's what should have been the plan all along.
What are your thoughts on the fact that Trump said before the meeting that there was potentially an opportunity for Zelensky to meet with Putin after their original meeting if things all went well? Now, of course, he's coming out and said that everything went well. It was a 10 out of 10 meeting, but we didn't see a meeting between Trump and Zelensky. I thought it was probably never going to happen. You probably assume the same. But then you see Trump come out and say that Zelensky needs to make a deal and that Russia is a very big power and Ukraine isn't. So and that it's ultimately up to Ukraine. So those are the kind of words that he was using around February, Bill, when he was on the side of Russia, or so we assumed he was. Are you thinking that Trump is going to tell Zelensky that he has to compromise?
Well, but there's nothing to compromise for. There's no proposal that's on the table from Russia to say, here's how the war could end. And so he can put as much pressure as he wants on Zelensky, but there's no deal to be done. Even an unfair deal, even a disgusting deal. There's no deal. The Russians want the whole thing. They want a total subjugation of Ukraine, and that's not going to happen. And so, this is a complicated story. This is, Trump has oversimplified this from the very beginning. This is not a story that ends in 24 hours. This is not a story where he can just bang everyone's heads together and make it all happen. Putin is in this war for his own personal, physical survival. He understands that if he's not in power, he dies. And he won't be in power if the war ends. And so, from his perspective, he wants the war to go on. And there's been no proposal about how this war could end from Putin. Putin could singularly and unilaterally end this war because he's the guy invading. And he has not shown any sign whatsoever that he wants to do that. And if he doesn't want to do that, he should be forced to do that. And to force him to do that, it requires very tough measures, and measures that we could take on him, but we haven't so far.
Do you think Trump knows that, Bill?
Of course Trump knows that. Trump is... like any other rational person, he sometimes he plays this unsophisticated dummy, but he knows exactly what's going on, and he's just trying to meander his way through this politically, geopolitically, etc. But of course he knows it.
I want to read out a quote from one of Putin's envoys. He told reporters after the summit, he said there were a lot of issues that were discussed and many were agreed upon. Some of them are to be agreed, and definitely it's very important that President Trump outlined the significant economic potential of cooperation between the US and Russia. Now, that is, of course, an economic cooperation between Russia and the United States is a far cry from the secondary sanctions that Trump had been threatening Putin with. So do you think that those sanctions that Trump was tabling are out of the question?
No, I mean, everything changes from day to day. And I think that when Trump gets back to Washington and he watches television today, he's going to find himself feeling really humiliated by what happened. He's going to be defensive. He's going to try perhaps to gaslight Americans into thinking that this was a success, but nobody's going to buy it. And then he's going to have to figure out what to do from there, because it does make him look weak. I think this is a very low point in his presidency. He made solving this war in Ukraine one of the primary pillars of his campaign. He repeated it over and over again, and it's completely fallen flat on its face. And so he needs to come up with a plan B now.
Putin, in his press conference, he called the United States his neighbor and that he acted very neighborly. He also said that Russia has always considered the Ukrainian nation a brotherly nation, and that both countries have the same roots, and that everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and a terrible wound. So, Bill, your reaction to the fact that he said that at the same time that Russia launched 85 attack drones and a ballistic missile overnight into Ukraine?
Well, we all know that Putin is a psychopath. He's a mass murderer. He's an indicted war criminal. I don't think that we need to look at the literal words that he says. I mean, I've seen him in action for a very long time. If a bunch of babies were being murdered in front of him, his heart wouldn't start beating any faster. He wouldn't have any adverse reaction. He's a terrible man. He's an evil human being. He's a criminal. And we need to contain this criminal, certainly not rolling out red carpets for him.
Trump said after the press conference that he was about to call NATO, he was about to call some European leaders and Zelensky as well. How do you think those phone calls would have gone with them?
Well, I think that every one of those phone calls, those individuals would say, okay, look, it didn't happen. What's the next step? We now need to be tough on Russia. How are we going to do that? Let's follow through on these sanctions. Let's follow through on military aid. Let's do that. I think that's the obvious conversation that any supporter of Ukraine, that Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Chancellor Merz, all these people will be having with Trump as the day goes by.
Do you think they'll be dipping into the rest of this confiscated Russian assets, Bill, and officially giving them to Ukraine?
Well, that's an obvious consequence. As long as the war goes on and Putin continues not to back off from the war, it's going to require money. And the money has got to come from somewhere. There's $300 billion of Russian money sitting there. And the question is, do we take that money? Does Putin pay for it? Or do the taxpayers of the UK, France, Germany, the United States pay for it? And I think it's obvious that in a world where finances are constrained, Putin should be paying for the defense of Ukraine, not the taxpayers.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.